Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever it is, wherever you are, welcome to the Good Values Podcast. Now, this is going to be part 2 of my conversation with Tom Foster. If you haven't seen it already, check out part 1. I will leave the link here. Now, that was a fantastic conversation, as I've already said. This second part is also incredible to me. All of these questions that I asked Tom, I'm kind of excited to know what his answers are, because it's so intriguing to me how these things come about. For example, how do comic book artists who have action scenes choreograph those scenes in their mind before they go onto the page? Questions like that and many more happen in this second part. So without further ado, here is part 2 of my conversation with Tom Foster. How do you work out these technical action scenes? Do you act them out, or like how do you actually visualize and project this type of, the viewer seeing this happen? How do you kind of like construct this type of action? Because there's certain filmmaking rules, like the 180 rule, where you can't have Dredd there and then in the next shot he's on the other side. It would just be, it wouldn't be rational for the viewer. So
that's, you've got to be kind of aware of the 180 rule and stuff like that. But also there's a additional tricky aspect with comics where the character who speaks first should always be on the left of frame, or on the left of the person who speaks next, so that the speech bubbles read left to right, the same way that you're reading the text. And that can play havoc with the 180 rule if the writer hasn't thought about it. Well, luckily that doesn't actually come up that often. So, but you sometimes need to think of some quite clever ways to situate the characters so that they're always on the right side of each other for who's supposed to be talking, but also so that you don't break those kind of rules of which way the action's going, so that it's easy to understand. And quite often solving that problem will present you with the interesting shot choice. Really? You go, well, I need to solve this problem, I need to do X, Y, Z in this panel. And then solving all those problems obviates the need for a major creative decision about how the panel's going to look, because you've arrived out of necessity at something which is kind of unusual or interesting. But let's just say that that's not an issue, that like the everything in the script lends itself perfectly to doing whatever you want with as a panel. That can be a real double-edged sword, because you then have to invent totally off your own bat. For me, the inspiration kind of chiefly comes from animation. I grew up on Saturday morning cartoons and stuff, so the way that they were directed and the way that those action sequences were directed is sort of always in the back of my mind when I am composing an action scene myself. Dialogue scenes and things can be interesting, because sometimes they're the ones that require the most help to make them visually interesting. But with 2000 AD, because each chapter is usually only about 6 pages long, the storytelling is usually quite lean and quite spare, and you very rarely, or at least in the Dredd stories that I've worked on, you very rarely get dialogue pages. You don't get talking heads pages, really. I certainly haven't had them. So you really don't have to worry about having lots of just close-ups of characters on one page, because you don't have the option. But I think you've got to be careful when you're drawing action that you don't kind of put too many hats on top of each other. Usually one visual effect is enough. So whether it's an unusual camera angle or a particularly sort of extreme foreshortening or something, you can usually get away with just doing one. As soon as you start putting lots and lots of visual effects into something, it actually kind of reduces it has a kind of homeopathic effect, you know. It reduces its effectiveness.
I would just see,
but with the sort of ostensible goal of trying to enhance the effect. And it doesn't really, there are times, like the chapter I just did, the last panel is like a Dutch angle and quite an extreme bit of foreshortening. And in all honesty, it's mostly that way because it was the first image that came into my head when I read the description. And that, you know, you generally go with your first instinct, because usually your first instinct, what's intuitive to you as the person drawing it, is often intuitive to the reader. But partly it was also because, like, the extreme foreshortening was a creative decision or dramatic decision, but the Dutch angle was kind of a compositional decision because, you know, there's one character lying in the foreground, dead on the ground, so your camera's down low at the ground level, but there's also, you've got to see like a figure standing over it, so they're like at full height when your thing in the foreground is a person lying down. So but also there's only so much space for that panel on the page, so I had to kind of tilt it so that the figure that's standing up is kind of diagonal, so that they can be full height and not get chopped off at the head. There's a lot of logistical decisions that end up being as much the thing that dictates the creative decisions.
It's a bit of a cliffhanger one, because obviously the Dutch angle indicates that something's gone wrong, and that, you know, reality is kind of askew now. So, yeah, exactly.
Well, I try and use it for that purpose rather than just use it all the time as a, like, I try not to have, I try not to overuse any particular visual effects, because they just, like, a lot of the time the most satisfying and the most digestible storytelling is the simplest storytelling. And every time you make a decision that's supposed to put people off kilter a little bit, you've got to remember that that's what you're doing, you know, that you are consciously disorienting the reader a little bit, and doing that a little bit every so often is very effective. Doing it with every panel just makes it a kind of a morass of, like, kind of misfiring energy all over the place, and it can be exciting to look at, but it can actually be quite
ineffective if it's overused.
Like, you find yourself drifting mentally out of the story more often than if everything's quite tightly on rails for the most part, and then just gets kind of upended every now and again.
Now, I wanted to ask you as well that you mentioned, this is again because I got some notes from watching the 2000 AD podcast, the lockdown podcast, and some of the things you mentioned there, that you, oh no, it wasn't actually, sorry, it was, I think it was on your Instagram account, sorry, you mentioned that you were attending Thought Bubble. I think this was maybe last year, was it, that you went to Thought Bubble?
I mean, I've been at Thought Bubble every year that it's been running since.
Have you?
2011. Although I'm only exhibiting from, I guess, like 2014 onwards, because I wasn't a professional until, like, so I went as an attendee, because that's, you know, I entered the 2000 AD portfolio competition. The first few years. But I've been every time they've held it. So obviously lockdown put the kibosh on it in 2020.
Yeah.
But I've been there every year. But sorry, carry on.
I was just going to ask because it's not actually as I've attended Thought Bubble a few times. I've been a guest there once where I got to have a table, but I saw one 2000 AD artist, and there was one artist who had a portfolio folder of their artwork, and there was no speech bubbles or captions. And I appealed to them to speak to whoever possible to publish some issues of 2000 AD without the words. Now, I know it would do a disservice to the writer, but some of the communication that occurs just visually, and it looks so nice without having all the bubbles and the and the kind of different, I suppose it's also the kind of onomatopoeic, the action sounds that occur here and there as well, which obviously are part of the texture of a comic book, but to see it without it is fantastic. Is that anything that is there any way for you to kind of campaign for that to be something you...
I think where you're most likely to see something like that is if there's supplemental material when they produce them as a graphic novel. So I did the first run I did on Storm Warning when it came out as a trade paperback with another story called Strange and Dark. They let me use the arse end of the book as a kind of gallery of some of the original black and white artwork, because the coloring on the first series of Storm Warning reproduced quite dark, and you could often, a lot of the line work wasn't all that visible, and I'd spent a very, very long time on the line work, and it was, I just, in a way, I didn't have an Instagram account at the time, and I just wanted to showcase, because it was very early in my career, I wanted to showcase some of the artwork as it was when I made it, and so they let me do that. So there's a gallery section at the end of that graphic novel that has a bunch of the original artwork, some full pages, some single panels, and they don't have the lettering or anything on them. It's just the artwork. I think that's that's where you'd be most likely to see it, because that it is just, unless they produced an art book.
Yeah, that's what I think I was hoping for. I know it's a bit of a selfish request because obviously the writers put so much work into the story, but when I saw that folder, I was shocked with how beautiful the artwork is, untouched by any of the lettering. It's just so nice to see the work as it is.
I think the only thing, I think the writers would only feel aggrieved if you reproduced an entire story.
I see.
Without the text.
Yeah.
But if you had a 2000 AD art book that was just, individual pages from artists, the original artwork without the lettering, I don't think the writers would mind that at all, any more than the artists would feel particularly aggrieved if 2000 AD put out a book of scripts or something, although I suppose that would often be the whole, a whole story without the artist's contribution. But I don't think anybody would really mind. But what people object to generally is when their work isn't credited or they're not properly compensated for it. If you're just doing a showcase for, for the artwork or for the writing or whatever, I'd be very surprised if anyone was that bothered. I put it this way: if they decided to put out a script book for some of the stuff that I've worked on, some writers' stuff that I've worked on, it wouldn't bother me personally. But it would be nice to see an art book like that. I mean, there's a couple of Apex editions that Rebellion have put out that are, big artists editions of artists' work. Most of them do have the lettering on them because, at the time it was physically like glued onto the pages. But again, the artists were aware of that when they drew it, so that, you know, it will have been drawn with that in mind.
Yeah.
So the artist's intention was for you to see it with the writing on it. But yeah, if they ever do a trade paperback of any of my Dread stuff or whatever, it'd be nice to try and get some of the original pages in there, just the black and white artwork or whatever, a bit like the stuff on my Instagram, where I kind of break the process down and stuff. It's always nice to get that stuff out there, because it constitutes such a big part of your day when you're making it. All these decisions you have to make and stuff. And when you're working in complete isolation at a drawing board every day, it can be nice to have a little bit of, even if it's a remote communication of the labor that's gone into it with the people reading it. You know, I think there's people who'd be interested in reading it or seeing the original work.
It's nice, and you show the pencil and then some of the lines and then the finished work, don't you? You kind of split up certain posts that you've done so that you can see side by side the process, the development. And I'm not the only one who absolutely loves seeing the rough drafts and then how you clean them up, because it's absolutely beautiful work.
Well, that's the stuff I would want to see if I, you know, like, as a fan of other people's work, I always like to see the development stuff. So that's, you know, that was kind of part of my rationale. The other thing was, like when I started doing it, when I started putting out panels that, you know, where they still had the perspective grids on them and stuff, I started getting way more likes on Instagram. Because, you know, people take an interest in that stuff. Whereas when you post fully finished artwork, people don't tend to engage with it as much a lot of the time, because partly, I think, because they don't necessarily know that you did it. It might just be a picture you like.
There are accounts that do that.
And I mean, it can be annoying when people, you know, repost your work without crediting it or whatever. But I think ultimately the thing that interests people about following artists' accounts on Instagram is because they're interested in the process of making it as much as in the finished product. Usually, you know, that they're interested in seeing nice drawing and, you know, good high quality work that people have produced, and that doesn't necessarily limit itself to the end result. You know, often the prelim can be as visually appealing, sometimes more so than the finished product. It's just that there needs to be a consistency to the finished product. So you got to produce it to a kind of publishable standard. But you'll quite often lose something that's quite vital about.
There's a lot of life in the rough lines, isn't there? Still, yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, I was going to mention as well that because of your From the Drawing Board video being so comedic, I was wondering if that's a side of you that you're tempted to kind of explore in kind of, you know, social media, and because you've got such a good tone for comedy. I mean, it was so well received. All of the comments, just like my experience, were just overwhelmed at how entertaining the video was and how great a job you did of, you know, poking fun at the process of drawing comics, as much as it's something which is so meticulous. It's something which you can satirize so well. You specifically,
thank you.
You've got a great voice for that.
It's something I do enjoy doing. And when I started working in comics, I also started doing stand-up, and I was doing stand-up as a part-time job, very sort of close together. I started stand-up and working for 2000 AD. I did my first stand-up gig around about the same time that I think around about the same time as I started working on Storm Warning, which was my first like proper run like a series in a comic. And yeah, I would do a few gigs a month or whatever, you know, and I would try and build up material and stuff. And then just sort of towards the end of 2019, I did my best paying gig, and probably my favorite gig that I'd ever done, because I'd actually, like, up until that point, I'd worked exclusively with The Stand. It's a chain of comedy clubs. There's 3 of them, one in Glasgow, one in Edinburgh, one in Newcastle. I'd never done the Newcastle one, because obviously it's quite a ways to travel, you know, and it's not like they don't book you for the Newcastle one if you live in Scotland, really. But a comedian that I was on the bill with a previous night asked if I'd come down and do a support slot for him. And it was, initially it wasn't going to be paid, but it was, you know, it was never a sense that I was being taken advantage of or anything. It was because it was a very nice and very professional comedian, and he was very clear with me from the start, you know, but at the same time it was, you know, a good opportunity. It was a nice big audience. Newcastle Stand's lovely. It's a really great venue. And just to be invited by somebody who was, you know, a working, successful comedian, and such a pleasant person, was a real, you know, privilege. And so I went down and did that gig, and they ended up making enough money on the door that, you know, I got paid more for that gig than I had for any other gig before that.
Fantastic.
And it was great, but of course the next year lockdown happened.
Yeah.
And also I got my first Dread series, and you know, I really had to prioritize working on that, and also not potentially taking money from comedians who were reliant on stand-up gigs for their income, because I was never at any point paying my bills with the money I made from doing stand-up. That was always a kind of a bonus. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't relish the thought of doing stand-up gigs for remotely either. So my hat goes off to the comedians who, you know, had to plow their trade that way for such a long time.
Yeah.
And I think maybe once this Dread story's finished, because it is the sort of the end of a trilogy of Dread stories, to which I was kind of committed from the moment the first one ended. I might try and get back into stand-up again, but it's difficult to do both.
Yeah.
They're both quite draining in different ways, but that actually they do complement each other quite well, because you know, you're with comics, you spend days and days and days and days on stuff, weeks on stuff that's going to be read in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But with stand-up, you use the same 15 minutes of material for, you know, potentially months.
Yeah.
In 15-minute bursts, you know, and it's a really nice instant kind of gratification as well. You're not waiting for months for it to come out and then nobody reviews it, you know, like you're getting instant reviews from the audience.
Yeah.
And it really kind of sort of scratches that itch that working on comics can kind of be missing a little bit, which is that sense of a relationship with the audience. But the priority has always been comics, and that video I did for 2000 OD is kind of gives an idea of one possible way that the two could be brought together to make something, and that hasn't the the implications of that have not been totally lost on me, but it's just a case of finding the time to explore that side of things a little bit more. Drawing comics is a very demanding job, and if you want to be good at it to the point where your work stands out, you have to kind of there's so many different things that you have to be constantly educating yourself about. And so the time for writing, like the possibility, like I had considered the possibility of writing my own stuff, comic stuff, but I think there are a couple of potential projects that I could write myself and it would be okay, because I either know enough about the subject or believe enough in the story that I could have the motivation to kind of populate it properly with entertaining story beats and really pay attention to the way that the plot was constructed. But for the most part, I'm kind of wary of doing that, because writing is just as much of an artistic discipline as drawing is. And to think that I could just segue from one into the other would kind of almost be an insult to the amount of time that I've spent on one of them, and presumably writers have spent themselves on the other. Like if a comic book writer said to me, I'm thinking of starting to draw my own stuff, part of me would be thinking, well, it's not that simple. It takes a while.
About it for a while.
It takes years to get good at it. And a lot of it is just getting the mistakes out of your system, getting the stuff that you don't realize you don't do very well. Like you've got to do a lot of bad drawings before you start doing good ones. And same is true of writing. You've got to write a lot of rubbish before you start writing stuff that's good. And so my concern would be that I haven't written enough rubbish yet.
Okay, so that is part 2 done. I love that. I love every part of this conversation. It could have been 5 times longer, in my opinion. I love talking to Tom about this stuff. I thought he was so funny. I like the fact that I got to include his comedic kind of personality into the conversation as well, because you see hints of it in the conversation, but in the video that he made online, which I will leave a link in the description below, it's so evident how talented he is at being funny, as well as his creative artistic abilities, which is so strong. And I just love the style that he has. If you like this conversation, then please leave a like, leave a comment in the comment section down below, because I do read them. I try to respond to everyone's comment and I really appreciate it. Share this account with friends and family if you can, and support Tom on his social media links. They'll all be in the description below. Part 3 will be coming next week, when I discuss with Tom, there's a discussion about where tricky situations can arise, where certain characters have been established a particular way by the artist, and then the writer's narrative for the story takes it in a direction where the character development has now impacted the design. That may not be so clear what I'm talking about, but basically some hot political topics and trying to navigate that carefully and considerately. And that's what we discuss. And it's actually really fun. And he shared with me an image which I can show on the podcast next week, which shows exactly the frame that he's talking about. And he explains in detail why it was such a tricky thing to consider and to balance out. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next episode.